Thank you everyone for joining tonight to learn everything you wanted to know and probably a little bit more about the COVID-19 vaccines. Just a brief mention, it's typical in medical presentations to tell your audience if you have any relationships with industry like pharmaceutical companies. No pharmaceutical company is sponsoring this talk and no pharmaceutical company gives me any money. I do have a vested non-financial interest in keeping people safe and healthy. So I come to this presentation with that background. So I won't be answering any specific medical questions and I will not be giving any medical advice tonight. Please ask those questions if you still do have them of your own family doctor, or if I happen to be your family doctor, please book an appointment with me to discuss those issues. If you are just here to find out whether your local family doctors recommend getting the COVID vaccine and you have to get off to get the kids to bed or book a COVID swab for little Johnny who came home with a runny nose from school today, I will, save you some time and say, COVID is bad, vaccines are good, please get your vaccine. It's very safe, it's very effective. If you're here for some more in-depth information, here is an outline of where we're going this evening. So I will briefly discuss what is COVID-19. And after talking about the bad news, I'm going to move on to the good news about what vaccines are available. I will go through quite a bit of detail, not actually, but it takes maybe 3 to 5 minutes to talk about how the mRNA vaccines work and then how the viral vector vaccines work. These are the two different types of vaccines that we have available for COVID-19 currently. I'll go through vaccine efficacy, I'll go through vaccine safety, some side effects after you get the vaccine, what you can expect after you get the vaccine, and those 12 frequently asked questions. So briefly, what is COVID-19? It's the disease we've all been living with since it was first reported to WHO December 31st of 2019, but most of us, probably about a year ago this week, was when COVID really first became real to us. So many, most, or all of us are familiar with this image. This is not my image. I did not get this electron microscope picture except by Googling it. This is an image of the virus that causes COVID-19, which is known as the SARS-CoV-2 virus. When we look at it, we see these red things. I'll just draw your attention to those. That is what's known as the spike protein. So the spike protein is important for how the virus can infect you and get into your cells. And it's also very important for how the vaccines work. So as I said, COVID-19 is a disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We're all sick of being screened at every single building we enter about the symptoms, but just in brief, we can see fever, cough, shortness of breath, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, sore throat, runny nose, loss of sense of taste and smell. And in our elderly folks, we can see confusion and delirium, an increased number of falls, extremely low blood oxygen levels, and then the rate of death is quite high in the elderly population. And so I do talk a little bit at the beginning here about what is COVID-19, because it's important to know what the disease we're trying to fight is. And a lot of the death and suffering from COVID-19 has been behind closed doors. So either in hospitals, in long-term care and retirement homes, and then the folks who are sick but not sick enough to go to the hospital are home and isolating. So for the most part, unless you've had COVID or you're a frontline healthcare worker like myself, you actually probably haven't seen anyone who has COVID. And I just left this slide up for while I'm talking, so you can look at it and really understand the differences in death rate, at least, between influenza and COVID. So to answer the question at the top of the slide, isn't it just a bad flu? No, COVID is not just a bad flu. The rate of death is off the scale different. The symptoms themselves are quite different. The rate at which you get sick is very different. And having being quite an experienced family physician and having seen over 80 people in person who have COVID, I would say that those are two very different illnesses, and COVID is not something that you want to get. So to summarize, while the age-related rates of death in COVID are kind of very different, young folks tend to do very well. If we take all Canadians who've gotten sick, the rate of death from COVID is roughly 25 times higher than what you would see from a seasonal influenza. And beyond just the death rate, we can see that it is a lot more contagious, like not even close. I haven't seen a single case of influenza this season. And if we look at the numbers from Canada, I think, and I may be wrong, but there have been no influenza outbreaks in Canada in this cold and flu season, at least none that I am aware of. And so we saw an enormous second wave of COVID during this time, where at the peak there were 4,000 cases a day of COVID-19 and 0 cases of influenza. I know at the office that I have seen, other than COVID and some minor coughs and colds, those are the only 2 respiratory viruses I've seen this year, and far more COVID than colds. So the how contagious it is, the rate of death, the rate of hospitalization, and the length of hospitalization, as well as rates of ICU admission and intubation, are a lot higher in COVID compared to influenza and other respiratory illnesses. And this is not just among our elderly population, like this is among our younger patients. Almost everyone in long-term care who got COVID did not go to the hospital. So the risk of the hospital being overwhelmed and ICUs being overwhelmed primarily came from our community dwelling folks. And I'll touch briefly on the COVID variants of concern. There are quite a few of these now, with the far and away the most common in Ontario being the B117, or the British variant. What is a variant of concern anyway? These are simply, it's the same virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but it has some mutations in it. And these mutations happen, there's a possibility that the mutations happen anytime the virus replicates. So anytime it infects a person, the virus replicates, and then when it is passed on to someone else, there's a lot more replication that happens there. So the more people who are infected, the more opportunity there is for a mutation. And the variants are important because they can have different rates of how contagious they are. Certainly we see this with the British variant. The severity of illness, the rate of death and hospitalization, the ability to cause a second infection in someone who's already had COVID before, and then the susceptibility to the vaccines may be different. And this is because the vaccines primarily work by identifying the spike protein. And if the spike protein looks very different in a variant, the vaccine may be less effective against that variant. But currently we have 4 vaccines, and the short answer to the question of do the vaccines work against the variants is yes. I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. So away with the bad news of COVID, onto the good news, like the truly miraculous news of the vaccines that we have in Canada. So we currently have 4 vaccines approved in Canada. We have the Pfizer-BioNTech, which is an mRNA vaccine. There are 2 doses for that one. The Moderna mRNA vaccine, also on a 2-dose schedule. AstraZeneca Oxford is a viral vector vaccine, so a slightly different type of vaccine, also on a 2-dose schedule. And then most recently approved is the Johnson & Johnson viral vector vaccine, which is a single dose. There are a few other vaccines in late-stage clinical trials with expected pending approval, including the Novavax vaccine, which is a 3rd type of vaccine. It's a protein subunit vaccine, and it's given on a 2-dose schedule as well. They just had a press release recently about their phase 3 clinical trials, and it looks like that one might have about 96% efficacy. But since it's not been approved by Health Canada yet, I'm not going to get into any great level of detail on that one. So what is an mRNA vaccine and how does it work? To really understand how an mRNA vaccine works, we're going to have to go back to some high school biology here. So bear with me for a few minutes while I go through that science to help us understand how these vaccines work. We talked at the beginning about the spike protein, and very early on in the pandemic, scientists were able to isolate the genetic sequence in the SARS-CoV-2 virus that encodes for that spike protein. What's important to know about mRNA and what its function is and how it works is, again, to go back to that high school biology. Your body is made up of cells. The functioning units of those cells are proteins. Where we get the instructions for those proteins is in your DNA, which is what gives all of the instructions for everything that makes you, you. We don't want our DNA to get damaged in any way, so it's kept safely in a part of your cell called the nucleus. To get the information from the DNA to become the functioning unit, which is the protein, we need to have that protein made at a part of your cell called your ribosome. Now, to get the information from your nucleus to your ribosome, we use a carbon copy of the recipe for that protein, and that's called your mRNA. So the mRNA comes over to your ribosome where it's translated into a protein, and very shortly thereafter, it is destroyed. So mRNA does not last for very long. And I'm going to answer this a little bit later on, but humans do not have the proteins or the enzymes necessary to convert mRNA into DNA. So it's not possible that the mRNA gets into your DNA and does anything that way. It's just simply not possible. So what, again, scientists were able to isolate that mRNA sequence, and mRNA is very fragile. So what they did is they encased it in a cholesterol coating, which allows it to be kept stable and to be brought into your cells. While it is able to be kept stable that way, it still is quite fragile. And that's why the two different mRNA vaccines, so the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna, need to be kept at such cold temperatures. They need to be kept shielded from light. Transport is quite difficult because you can't jiggle it too much. So we get the mRNA, it's now in your cell. Then your own cellular structure, so your ribosome, translates that mRNA into a spike protein. And that spike protein is then recognized by your immune system as not you, and you get this really big immune response to it. So if we take that same information, that same biology, and that same cellular machinery understanding, we can then understand how the viral vector vaccines work, which use a similar but different strategy to stabilize that mRNA sequence, get it into your cell so that your cell can then make the spike protein. So rather than using this very fragile cholesterol coating, what scientists did was they took viruses that cannot replicate in you, so they can't cause infection, and also that don't cause infections in humans, and put the spike protein gene sequence into that virus. So it's then the virus that carries that genetic information for the spike protein into your cell, and then your own cell makes the spike protein, and then all of it is destroyed by your immune system when your immune system recognizes that spike protein as being not you. So that's the basics of how those two vaccines work. And so it's great to know, how does this work? And you can, maybe even put people to sleep at your next dinner party telling them that story. But the big question is, do they work? And the answer is an all caps bold 5 exclamation mark, yes. So these are some of the best vaccines that we have ever made as humans, and not even by a little bit. So the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines, the first ones out of the gate, were shown to be 95 and 94% protective in preventing any symptoms at all of COVID-19, even a runny nose. If we look at the slightly less shiny numbers of the AstraZeneca, Oxford, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, but dive a little bit more deeply into those, we see that they're hovering around that 60% efficacy mark. And I'll just remind you that that 60% number that we see so often in the media is, again, any symptoms of COVID-19. Even that runny nose. So around 60% of people will have no symptoms at all if they get infected with COVID. For the AstraZeneca Oxford, there were 0 people who got the vaccine who are hospitalized or died. So it's very effective in preventing those things. And for the Johnson & Johnson, similarly, 85% protective against severe disease and 100% protective and prevent death. If we dive in a little more and look at why there might be such a big difference between those numbers, part of it is related to the timing of the trials. So the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Moderna vaccines, those trials were done at a time before there were a lot of variants circulating. The AstraZeneca, Oxford, and the Johnson & Johnson, there were quite a few variants circulating at that time, primarily the B117 variant and the South Africa variant. And when we look at the numbers that are coming out, not just from the trials, but from the real world data, because over 120 million people have been vaccinated for COVID by this time, that we see that the numbers are actually quite comparable in the real world between the mRNA vaccines and the viral vector vaccines. Like, they're very close, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail later. So it's great to know that these vaccines all work very, very well to prevent me from getting sick if I get vaccinated. But it's also really important to know, does it prevent me from getting you sick if I get vaccinated? And while no kind of public health body has come out and said, yes, absolutely, these vaccines do, this is an area of very active study and information is still developing. But just as I've said that there's a lot more real world data coming out about how well the vaccines do work, early research is suggesting that all of the approved vaccines are probably somewhere between 75 and 85% protective in preventing you from spreading it asymptomatically to other people. So stay tuned for that. Is probably going to come very soon, that the Public Health Agency of Canada will say that that is the case. So a lot of folks wonder what's going on with the safety of these vaccines. We first identified this virus December 31st, 2019, and then December 9th of 2020, we already have a safe and effective vaccine coming to market. And you may have heard that prior to this, the fastest ever vaccine to come to market took 4 years. So how is it that we were able to cut that down to a quarter of the time? Were there any steps skipped here? What happened? And so no steps were skipped in the usual process of developing, testing, approving, and manufacturing any of these vaccines. All of those steps did happen. So in Canada, we have a governing agency of independent scientists known as Health Canada that review all safety and efficacy data before any product is able to come to market. And particularly for vaccines, since vaccines are given to healthy people who do not have a disease, the bar for safety and efficacy is very, very high. And since these are given to very large numbers of people, there is ongoing, very rigorous safety monitoring that happens. And the usual process of Health Canada reviewing and monitoring has happened in this case. And so how was it that we were able to get these vaccines to market so quickly? It's a few reasons. Number one, money. There was lots of money being given to everybody in the vaccine development process because there was never before seen drive from individuals, from governments, from everybody to get a safe and effective vaccine as soon as possible. Another reason is that rather than the usual process of going through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, sending all 100,000 pages or what have you to Health Canada for the scientists to review when they get to it. And then once the approval happens, that manufacturing then starts. What happened here was that as the trials were ongoing, all of that data was being sent in real time to Health Canada for them to review, and they had no other priorities during this time. It's not like the data was sat on a shelf gathering dust. They were reviewing it as it came in. And the manufacturing started basically at the same time as the clinical trials started. So they were already up and manufacturing the vaccine. Typically, a company won't manufacture a vaccine until they know it's approved, because they don't want to lose money on it. But as I said, there was that never before seen drive to get this. And the companies were not going to have any financial losses if they started manufacturing and it didn't end up getting approved. I was very interested to learn when I was researching for this talk, how many people are usually in a trial and just how big these trials were compared to what we usually see, which is not to say that our usual vaccine trials aren't good. It just goes to show you how good these trials truly were. In a typical vaccine trial, we have somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people in them. And these were huge trials. The numbers are there on the screen. Pfizer BioNTech had over 45,000 people. Moderna had over 30,000 people. AstraZeneca Oxford over 11,000 people, and Johnson & Johnson had over 40,000 people. So to summarize, unlike other vaccines and other products that go one step at a time, all of the steps happened. They just happen layered on top of each other. And I have taken the time to review much of the literature that's available, not the full hundreds of thousands of pages available to Health Canada, because I do have a job as a family doctor. But I've taken the time to review it, and I have full faith in the vaccine approval process in these cases. All right, so what can I expect after getting the vaccine? The good news is none of the approved COVID vaccines can cause COVID-19. That would be counterintuitive. We would not want to give people COVID or make people sick at a greater rate than what we are already seeing in the world. So the minor discomfort that you might feel after getting a COVID vaccine is a good sign that your immune system is working to build up to fight COVID. So most of the time, just like with your seasonal flu shot or with your tetanus booster, you can expect to feel a sore arm the day after. Like 90% of people will feel that. I'm always surprised when that number isn't 100%, because there is a needle going into your arm. You might feel a bit of tiredness, a mild headache, maybe some fever, maybe some chills. All of these reactions will improve within 48 to 72 hours. Serious allergic reactions or serious adverse events are very, very rare, 1 to 5 per 1 million doses. And only about 1 in 10 people will feel crummy enough after getting their vaccine that they might want to take an acetaminophen or an ibuprofen. So this is a list of the side effects that you may experience. I know that I was never happier in my life to wake up with a sore arm than the day after I got my COVID vaccine, because it meant that my immune system was doing a great job building up to fight COVID. The rest of the symptoms are things that you may or may not experience when you do get your vaccine. Since these vaccines are so safe, there's actually a very, very short list of people who cannot get the vaccine. And there's a caveat there with that. So anyone who's had a previous severe allergic reaction to a COVID vaccine, so their first dose of their COVID vaccine, or who has had a severe allergic reaction to any of the vaccine components may not get the vaccine. But that's something you should reach out to your family doctor about. So signs that you may be allergic to one of the vaccine components are if you've had a previous anaphylactic allergy, so an allergy that was severe enough to need epinephrine or to wind you up in the hospital. So any vaccine or injectable. If you have a severe allergic reaction to Benadryl, Reactine, Tylenol, Easy Tabs, or Advil liquid gels, they have similar components in them, primarily PEG, which is also listed there. So if you have an allergy to PEG, please reach out to your family doctor. Typically with vaccines, if you've had an anaphylactic allergy to it, or if you have an anaphylactic allergy to a component, we don't give it to you. But COVID is bad enough that we actually now take steps to discover whether or not we actually can give people those vaccines, and that is done in conjunction with our allergist colleagues. So again, if you fall into that category, please reach out to your family doctor. Currently, the vaccines are only approved for children. So the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine is approved for those who are 16 years and older. The Moderna, AstraZeneca, Oxford, and Johnson & Johnson are approved for those who are 18 years and older, but they all have trials going on right now for our kiddos. So they all have trials going on for those 12 and up, and Moderna just started enrolling for 6 months to 11 years. So we should be seeing some data for our kids soon. So that they can get vaccinated at some point, hopefully in the near future. And I'll just highlight that there are some special populations that require some extra consideration, which is not to say that they should not get the vaccine, but likely they need to have a one-on-one risk-benefit discussion with their family doctor, such as folks who are pregnant, breastfeeding, or planning a pregnancy, or for those who are immunocompromised, either due to a medication, such as a chemotherapy, or due to a medical issue, or if you have an autoimmune condition, please speak with your doctor about those. So I've boiled it down to 3 reasons here about why should I get the COVID vaccine. Number 1 is to prevent COVID in yourself. You don't want to get sick. I don't want you to get sick from COVID. What we see is that among all comers, about 10% of people have pretty severe COVID symptoms. And then with COVID, it's not just that, 10 to 14 day illness, or sometimes quite a bit longer if you're hospitalized, but even if you get mild symptoms of COVID, you may go on to develop what's called long COVID syndrome, which is a constellation of symptoms such as fatigue, mental fog and confusion, shortness of breath, and chest pain and muscle aches that can last from 2 to 6 to even 12 months that we're seeing from so-called COVID long haulers right now. And I put the number out there of 10 to 30%. That's among all people, but it can be up to 90% of people who are hospitalized. So it's quite a few folks. So not only do you want to prevent yourself from getting sick, there's all of those around you to consider as well. And then not to be forgotten is to get back to a normal life. Over a year ago now, we stopped seeing each other in person indoors. We started wearing masks all the time. We started getting swabbed all the time. We're getting screened everywhere we go. We can't go to large events or, eat at restaurants like we used to. The best way for us to get out of this pandemic is to get to herd immunity, which is a term that's used for when there's a high enough level of immunity in a population that a virus or another illness is not able to circulate because there aren't enough people who can actually get sick from it. And it's estimated that that's around 70 to 80% of people for this disease. And certainly for many reasons far beyond what I can go through in this talk, it is not a good approach to just let people get sick with COVID. The best approach is to all get vaccinated. So I'm at the end of things, except for my frequently asked questions here. The most common question that I get, and I think all family doctors get, is when can I get my vaccine? So that is decided at the provincial level by a vaccine advisory council. The eligibility criteria are constantly being updated and changing as more and more people become eligible because we've been able to vaccinate so many people. Locally in Stratford, all of the eligibility information can be found on the Huron-Perth Public Health website. That's also where you can go for your vaccine booking information, okay? So that is constantly updating. Today is March 18th of 2021. The list of people who are eligible is extremely long, and it's expected that on Ontario, most people will have been offered their first dose of their vaccine by sometime in June of this year, which is in the very foreseeable future. Number 2, I'm not at risk of COVID. Why should I get a vaccine? So that graph that I showed at the beginning definitely points to the fact that our very elderly population, so 85 plus, and our frail folks are predominantly the people who are getting very sick and dying of COVID. And certainly in Ontario, there's been a lot of death in our long-term care homes. But that's not to say that younger folks or people who don't live in long-term care are not at risk of COVID. Certainly, we do see much higher rates of illness, hospitalization, intubation, and death in COVID than we would from our seasonal influenza. So every time anyone gets COVID, it's a roll of the dice as to whether you'll get severely ill. And I would say that there is no one who is exempt from potentially getting a severe illness or dying from COVID. So that is why I think that basically everybody who's eligible should be getting a vaccine. Number 3, I've already had COVID-19. Should I still get a vaccine? The recommendation currently is yes, that if you've had COVID before, you should still get a vaccine. We don't know how long your immunity will last for from getting a COVID infection. And certainly if you did get infected and it was quite a while ago, getting a booster with your COVID vaccine will do no harm. So currently the recommendation is yes, if you've had COVID, do get a vaccine. Number 4, I don't want to be a guinea pig. I'd rather wait to get my vaccine. I don't get this question quite as often as I did when the vaccines were first approved there in December, into December and January. Folks were a bit hesitant about getting these brand new vaccines. They've just come to market. It's a new type of vaccine. We don't understand a lot about it. But I hope that through the last 30 minutes or so, I've been able to go through the trials in enough detail that we know that these vaccines are pretty safe and pretty effective, and that's from very large trials that were done. And we now have, as I said, over 120 million people have been vaccinated against COVID. It might be a lot more than that now. So certainly I would say that anyone who is getting their COVID-19 vaccine now, this is not an experimental treatment. This was not approved by Health Canada for emergency use. This was approved under normal, as like the normal use. So I don't think that anyone now is a guinea pig. The 5th question I get is, what about the long-term data? Because these vaccines are just new, we actually don't have a lot of long-term data on them. Certainly, we don't know how long the immunity lasts for. I think we're all very interested to know how long am I going to be immune for? Am I going to need a booster in 6 months or 2 years? Are we going to need annual boosters? We just don't know that information yet. And this is something that's being actively studied. What I'll say to that is we also don't really know the long-term safety data of COVID. I mean, we know the short-term safety data of COVID, and it's terrible. Lots of people get very sick and die. So I think if we're comparing the two of those options, and unfortunately those are well, I mean, the vaccines aren't an unfortunate option, they're an excellent option. But we just don't have a lot of long-term data at all because this is a brand new disease. Everything here is new. So there is no long-term data. Number 6, will the mRNA vaccines alter my DNA? No, the mRNA vaccines can't alter your DNA because you do not have the enzymes necessary to make that happen. So it is just simply not possible. Number 7, will I still have to wear a mask after I'm vaccinated? Yes, you will. So the vaccines, when you get your vaccine, what we can see is that maybe by the 2-week mark after you get it, you're somewhere around 50 to 80% protected against like the full protection of what you'll get. And you don't get that full protection until about 2 weeks after your second dose. So it's currently recommended that even after you get your vaccine, you don't really change too much about your life and you continue to follow the public health measures of physical distancing, wearing a mask, washing your hands, staying home if you're ill, etc. That guidance is being constantly monitored and updated as it's needed. So we will continue to follow those guidelines until we no longer need to, which hopefully will be by the fall of this year or even the summer. Number 8, are the side effects worse after getting the second dose of the vaccine? I looked through the literature to see if I could find anything on this, and I really couldn't find any trials that showed that the side effects are worse after the second vaccine. Anecdotally, it's about the same. The first dose and the second dose, you feel about the same after you get them. Number 9, are the vaccines effective against the variants? Yes, they are effective against the variants. So one of the trials that it's just about to be published out of Scotland and the UK had 1.1 million people in it. And it showed that, you know, these vaccines are getting more and more data all the time, quite effective against the variants. It may not be that full 95% protection that we see against the wild type or the original coronavirus, but it is still quite effective. It really depends on the specific variant you're talking about and the specific vaccine you're talking about, because we're talking about many different things here, but the short answer is yes, they're quite effective. Number 10, especially for those in Ontario, my second dose was delayed, probably to the 16-week mark. Is this strategy still as effective? So many folks know that when the trials were done, so for the Pfizer, the second dose was at 21 days. For the Moderna, it was at 28 days. For the AstraZeneca Oxford, in the trial, it was 4 to 12 weeks. Why was this decision made to delay our vaccines to that 16-week mark? Isn't it better to just do exactly what was done in those trials? And this decision was made for a few different reasons. And I'll just give you a scenario that kind of helps highlight why this decision was made. So say you and I are standing in a room together. We have our masks on and our face shields. We're safe that way. We're standing there together. There are 2 of us, and there are 2 doses of vaccine. We can either give you 2 doses of that vaccine and you have 95% protection and I have 0, or we give you 1 dose and we give me 1 dose and we both have somewhere around 80 to 90% protection at the 4-week mark. I think that kind of highlights that it makes perfect sense to have 2 people vaccinated versus 1. And certainly this wasn't the way that it was done in the trials, but we're seeing more and more real world data. Again, I'll point to that trial of 1.1 million people coming out of Scotland that showed that the vaccines are quite effective up to that 90+% mark at the 1 month mark, and that's on a single dose. So I would say that I fully support this decision. In fact, my dose was delayed and I'm totally fine with that, because I want you to get yours too. Number 11, I've heard the AstraZeneca vaccine causes blood clots and I'm worried. Should I get that one if it's offered? Now, breaking news, I was just seeing right before I started this talk that the European regulators came out with the conclusion of their investigation into whether blood clots were caused by the AstraZeneca vaccine, and they have said no, that there is no safety risk with blood clots in the AstraZeneca vaccine. So I will just speak very briefly on this, that blood clots are actually quite a common thing that's seen in medicine. And so what we can see here is that the post-vaccine monitoring was effective. There were serious adverse events that were reported. There was a question as to whether it was caused by the vaccine. An investigation happened and it was found to be safe. So should you get the AstraZeneca vaccine if it's offered? Yes, absolutely, you should get it. It is both safe and effective. And for a third time, I'll point to that trial of 1.1 million people that is coming out of Scotland and the UK, that the AstraZeneca vaccine might slightly outperform the Pfizer vaccine, in that it might be slightly more effective. So AstraZeneca is good, and there is the issue with blood clots, I think now has been resolved. But as always, there's that ongoing safety monitoring that happens. And number 12, Doc, we have 4 vaccines that are available. Which one of those 4 should I get? And I did address this a little bit earlier on, but I think that a year into this, or a year and a bit, however you want to keep track, it's easy to forget that this is a public health emergency, that, you know, people are dying, that there's a risk that our hospitals and ICUs can get overwhelmed, that our frontline healthcare workers are quite burnt out and quite fearful of a third wave. When we're sitting in our homes and don't see a lot of COVID, but this is still a public health emergency where there are people dying and there is a risk that our hospitals might get overwhelmed and that our healthcare workers will get burnt out. And so My answer is get the first vaccine that you are offered. If we need to figure out sometime after everyone's been vaccinated that perhaps if you got the Johnson and Johnson, that you get a booster of Pfizer and that gives you better protection, or if we need to get a separate booster that protects better against the variants, we will figure that all out once the immediate wildfire of the public health emergency has been put out. But currently, I would recommend just get the first vaccine that is offered to you. So if even after all of this, listening to me prattle on for nearly 45 minutes here, you're still not sure if the vaccine is right for you, please reach out to your primary care provider, especially if you have specific medical questions or medical concerns. There's a lot of misinformation out there, so it's best to go to a trusted source. And on that note, I'll just leave this slide up while we go to the Q&A, that if you are really excited about listening to me talk about mRNA vaccines and all the different types of vaccines for 45 minutes and you want more information, the Huron-Perth Public Health has an excellent COVID-19 vaccine webpage, which you can find by an internet search. And then for general information on COVID-19 and vaccines, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, Public Health Agencies of Canada and Ontario, and then the Centre for Effective Practice all have excellent and reliable information for you. So I will now take any questions that there are. Teresa, do you want to?
Yes, so thanks very much for this wonderful presentation, Dr. Reaume. I have a question from Pat. Thanks for this fascinating presentation. Since there were no participants over 65 in the AstraZeneca trials, how do we know that the 59 to 60% efficacy would apply to older patients? Is there any information out there on this? Also,
go ahead.
You want to answer that part of the question, Dr. Reaume?
Yeah, I'll take that one first. So that's as of like last week, and I think I've updated the presentation like 10 or 15 times, basically every day since I made it, that the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, or NACI, in Canada did not recommend the use of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine in those over 65 until, was it this week, or yes. I think it was this week that they made that change. And so if we look at the trial, it only had 11,000 people. It didn't have 0 people who were over 65, but it had very few, such that when you went into like analyzing the specifics of it, it was very difficult to say exactly how well it worked in older folks. But when we look at, and you're going to be so bored with me prattling on about the same 1.1 million people trial out of the Scotland and the UK, is that was primarily with elderly people. So that is like 1.1 million people versus 11,000. And again, primarily elderly folks, that it was reaching that like a more than 90% efficacy at the 28-day mark. So the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine, I thought they would have updated it a little bit sooner, but they took their time to review the literature very carefully. And so I do recommend that, just like NACI does, that vaccine can be given for all folks who are over 18 years old.
Okay, so I think you've actually answered the other part of Pat's question. Also, do you have any information on how protection following the AstraZeneca vaccine holds up over time compared to, let's say, Pfizer, for example?
Yeah, it might even be, so it's all of this is like constantly changing. I remember looking at a graph a couple of weeks ago and it looked like AstraZeneca stays very high. I think it was following out until almost 45 days. And that Pfizer was slightly lower, but again, holding steady. So I would say that they're like at least equal, if not AstraZeneca being better.
Okay. So Indigo asks a question. I heard that you should avoid taking acetaminophen after getting vaccinated because it might affect the efficacy. Can you speak about this, Dr. Reaume?
Yeah. So I've gotten actually that question as well when I'm running the vaccine clinics. And I'm not aware of any evidence, like a trial that would show that the acetaminophen makes it slightly less effective. It may be on the basis of a trial that was done a few years ago in children who were pre-dosed with acetaminophen prior to getting their childhood immunization. So this, I mean, we're really delving far afield here, because this is not a childhood immunization, and we're not it's not the same vaccines, and the people aren't children, where they showed that there may be slightly lower antibody levels in those kids, but we actually don't have any evidence as to whether it protects better or not. So I would say that I don't even rely on that specific trial for making clinical decisions in who it actually applies to. And I fully recommend that. I mean, if you feel crummy enough to take a Tylenol, take a Tylenol.
Okay.
I think it's fine. That was a long answer.
Thanks for that answer. Vince asked the question, can we get to herd immunity without our children, 0 to 18 years of age, being immunized?
Yeah, good question. I should have looked that up, what percentage of our population is. I think the answer is probably no, that we can't get to herd immunity without kids being immunized, just because of the percentage of our population that they make up. And hopefully very soon we don't have to do that. For now, we only have adults who are approved, but it's expected that most of the vaccines will be approved for those 12 and older sometime in the summer. So hopefully we can get our teens vaccinated before they head back to school in the fall. But eventually we'll need to get all our kids on board too, because even though kids get sick less, they still do get sick, and some of them get very sick, and some of them even die, which is quite tragic. So I'm hopeful that those trials will come out very shortly.
Okay, thank you for that. Susan asks the question, the second dose being extended to 16 weeks still seems like playing with fire. I totally respect your comment about 1 month, but where do we come to the decision to extend to 4 months?
Yeah, so the scientists who were kind of behind this decision have been defending it for weeks, because they did make we truly don't have any real world data or trial data to show that 16 weeks is fine. So it's one thing to make decisions solely on the basis of science, but we also, especially in a pandemic situation, have to consider ethics. So as I said, the two people in the room story that I told, so we have some scientific data to back it up, like AstraZeneca goes to 12 weeks. We have the ethics of the situation, we have the emergency of the situation, and then we have common sense as well. So every other vaccine that we have, with one exception being rabies, which is a totally different beast, so we just can kind of put that aside. None of the other vaccines that we give, do we need to give them on like a very specific timeline down to a day, or else your immunity suddenly drops to 0. Like, it does not make sense to me that you would get 95% protection and then suddenly it drops to 0 within a couple of weeks. So if we use some common sense and some background information, it's very likely that delaying it to 16 weeks is fine. But again, as a physician, I do love a randomized control trial to hang my hat on to say that this is fine, and we don't quite have that
here. So there's a question from Marion. Might we receive a first dose of one COVID vaccine and a second dose of a different vaccine? If so, does it matter if one is mRNA and the other one a viral vector or vaccine?
Sure, super. Yeah. So right now there's no mixing and matching of vaccines. So if your first dose is Pfizer, your second dose is Pfizer. There isn't even mixing and matching between like first dose Pfizer, second dose Moderna. I did allude to that, potentially in the future we may give a booster of a different one, but that is a purely hypothetical speculation. Currently, there's no mixing and matching with vaccines.
Okay, and thanks for that answer, Dr. Reaume. And another question: after we are fully vaccinated, what do you think we can start to do that we could not do before?
Yeah, so we're seeing some of the countries that have a lot higher vaccination rates than we do getting back to like a really normal life. So I'm so excited about this, because like I've been just like you guys, trapped in my house, although I do go to work and I have managed COVID outbreaks, which, let's not do that again. But we're seeing in Israel and in the United States that they're having their guidelines updated, and that like fully vaccinated people can have a dinner party in a house together with each other without masks on, getting 6 feet apart, singing and dancing and eating and drinking. So I expect that once we have more and more people vaccinated, that we can get back to doing truly normal things, not this like fake, unenjoyable new normal that we've had for the past year.
Okay, thank you. Vince presented, loved the presentation, Dr. Reaume. Is it within the standards of practice for medical doctors in Ontario to generally recommend not being vaccinated to their clients or patients?
No. So I'm not aware of any doctor who's currently practicing who would recommend against vaccination, unless of course you have a contraindication to getting a vaccine.
Okay, so I think that will close our presentation for this evening. So on behalf of Dr. Reaume, myself, and Jen, who has been in the background doing our tech support, we want to thank you for attending this learning session, and we hope that you have found it very informative.